At 2 p.m. on May 28, 1996, Church Deacon Samuel Lee Smithers was trimming branches behind a rural property in Plant City. By nightfall, 2 women were dead, and deputies were following drag marks toward a pond. Before the headlines, before the flashing lights and police tape, Samuel Lee Smithers was a man most people in Plant City, Florida would have called trustworthy. Born in 1954, Smithers grew up in a conservative Southern home, attending church every Sunday and helping neighbors mow their lawns after school. He was known for his quiet manners and soft-spoken nature, the kind of man who waved to everyone on his street. By the late 1980s, he'd built a stable life as a landscaper and eventually became a deacon at East Side Baptist Church, a position that earned him deep respect in the community. Before becoming a church deacon, Samuel Lee Smithers lived an ordinary, quiet life that gave little hint of the violence to come. Smithers grew up in a working-class household where religion played a steady role but not an obsessive one. He attended local schools and was described by former classmates as polite but distant, someone who kept mostly to himself. After high school, Smithers found work as a landscaper, eventually starting a small business maintaining residential yards and church grounds. For most of his adult life, he maintained a clean record. There were no known arrests or major disciplinary issues before the murders that later shocked Hillsborough County. His neighbors and church peers often mentioned how Smithers seemed almost too mild-mannered to ever raise his voice, much less commit a crime. By the time he became a deacon at East Side Baptist Church in the early 1990s, Smithers had built the image of a humble, God-fearing man. Yet beneath that calm surface, something deeply disturbed had begun to take root, something he managed to hide for years. But behind that calm and faithful exterior, something was changing. Friends later recalled that around 1995, Smithers began showing signs of inner turmoil. He'd separated from his wife, struggled financially, and was said to have developed a growing obsession with control and appearances. Witnesses described how he would sometimes work late into the night at clients' properties, talking to himself or appearing unusually tense. His landscaping business, once thriving, had slowed down. Yet as a deacon, he continued to preach about repentance and morality, a contradiction that would later haunt the congregation. Support this channel by subscribe to this channel for more real-life cold cases that have been solved. Every view, like, and comment keeps these victims' names alive and ensures their stories are not forgotten. Drop your city or country and time you are watching in the comments, and I will create a video on a cold case from your area, because every community has stories that deserve to be told. By early 1996, Plant City residents began noticing Samuel spending more time alone on the church's 27-acre property, a quiet stretch of land with ponds and thick brush. He claimed he was maintaining it, but neighbors later testified that he was often seen digging or dragging tools into the woods. Those details would become critical after May 1996, when 2 women, Christy Cowan and Denise Roach, went missing within weeks of each other. To the people who once prayed beside him, the revelation that Samuel Smithers was the last person seen near both victims would shatter everything they believed about faith, trust, and evil hiding in plain sight. Investigators would later learn that Samuel Lee Smithers didn't strike by chance. He planned his moves with quiet calculation. Behind his mild eyes and soft church demeanor was a man who understood how to blend trust with opportunity. Smithers knew where to find women who were struggling. The rundown motels along East Hillsborough Avenue, places where no one asked questions and no one looked twice. He drove his old white pickup through those streets, often dressed neatly, speaking politely, and sometimes flashing his church badge if anyone asked. To the women he approached, he didn't seem dangerous. Just another man offering a few dollars for yard work or cleaning jobs. Detectives later pieced together that Smithers targeted those least likely to be reported missing right away. Women without stable homes, battling addiction, living day to day. Witnesses described how he would show up at night, circle the motels, and talk softly through the truck window, convincing his victims they could earn quick cash helping on the church's property. Once isolated, Smithers' tone changed. The kindness faded. In his confession, he admitted that something snapped inside him during an argument, first with Christy Cowan, then weeks later with Denise Roach. Both women were last seen alive stepping into his truck. He believed his position as a deacon would shield him from suspicion. But in the end, that same trust, the one he so carefully built, became the very thing that shattered his world when police found what he'd tried to hide. Christy Cowan was born on April 2, 1972, Hillsborough County, Florida. Before addiction took hold, Christy Lynn Cowan was remembered as a bright, soft-spoken young woman from Plant City, Florida. She was the middle child in a working-class family, a father who repaired air conditioners and a mother active in the local PTA. Growing up, Christy was creative and kind, known for sketching portraits of her classmates and talking about moving to Orlando one day to study art. But by her early 20s, the stability of home unraveled. After a bad breakup and exposure to cocaine through friends, Christy's life shifted from weekend use to dependency. She tried to get clean several times, even attending a short-lived rehab program in Lakeland, but each time she slipped back into addiction. By 1996, she was living transiently, bouncing between motels along East Hillsborough Avenue, particularly the El Rancho and Palm Court, both known drug corridors. Witnesses described her as thin, exhausted, and nervous, often asking for cash or rides to a friend's job. On May 5, 1996, she was last seen stepping into a white pickup truck with a middle-aged man later identified as Samuel Lee Smithers. That was the last confirmed sighting of her alive. Denise Roach was born November 8, 1964, Tampa, Florida. Denise Ann Roach grew up in Tampa with two younger sisters and a reputation for being the family's caretaker. Her early life was stable. She attended Middleton High School, worked part-time at a nursing home, and became a mother in her early 20s. But her marriage ended abruptly, and by 1991, Denise was battling depression and an addiction to crack cocaine that started after experimenting with painkillers. Her family tried repeatedly to help her, but she drifted between relatives' homes and motel rooms, spending much of 1995-1996 in East Tampa's prostitution corridor to support her habit. Friends recalled that Denise often spoke about wanting to get her children back, even as her addiction deepened. In late May 1996, she told a friend about a nice man from a church who offered her work cleaning a yard, a promise that seemed harmless, maybe even hopeful. Days later, she vanished. Both women's disappearances, though separated by weeks, shared chilling similarities. Same area, same pattern, same man. When investigators connected the details, they realized Christy and Denise weren't random victims. They were deliberately chosen, women struggling unseen and easy to approach, by someone who knew exactly how to earn their trust before taking their lives. It was a humid Tuesday afternoon when Marion Whitehurst, a longtime member of Eastside Baptist Church, decided to stop by her property on Turkey Creek Road in Plant City, Florida. The land, roughly 27 acres of secluded woods, brush, and shallow pond, had been in her family for years. She often let trusted members of the congregation use parts of it for church landscaping projects or quiet reflection. One of those people was Deacon Samuel Lee Smithers, a man she considered not only reliable but godly, someone who spoke softly, prayed deeply, and never gave her reason to worry. That trust was about to be tested. Marion drove up the dirt path toward the old carport, the tires of her sedan kicking up fine dust in the afternoon sun. The place was unusually still. As she pulled closer, her attention caught on a white pickup truck parked just outside the carport, Samuel's. Its tailgate was down, a shovel leaning loosely against the bumper. It wasn't uncommon to find him there. He often claimed he used the property to store tools for his landscaping jobs. But that day, something about the stillness felt off. When she stepped out, she immediately heard the rhythmic splash of water. Following the sound, Marion approached the carport and stopped cold. Inside, Samuel Smithers stood over a large metal wash basin, rinsing the blade of an axe under running water from a garden hose. The water ran dark, reddish at first, then fading into a murky brown. Marion's instincts tightened. She greeted him cautiously, asking what he was doing. Smithers looked up, startled, but quickly composed himself. His voice, calm but forced, carried across the open air. "Oh, hey, Marion. I was trimming tree limbs. Must have hit something. Maybe an animal. There was blood out here earlier. I was just cleaning up." She followed his gesture, her eyes tracing toward the concrete floor of the carport, where she noticed a large pool of blood, still wet enough to glisten in the light. The stain spread unevenly, with drag marks leading toward the brush line near the pond. Her pulse quickened. "Are you sure it was an animal?" she asked, uneasy but polite, still trying to believe the man she knew from church couldn't be lying to her. Smithers smiled, nodding slightly. "Probably a raccoon or something. You know how they wander around here. I'll get it cleaned up, don't worry." Marion didn't know what else to say. She stayed only a few minutes longer, making small talk. But she couldn't shake the image of that dark water pouring off the axe. As Marion left, she kept glancing at her rearview mirror, watching Samuel's figure grow smaller until he disappeared behind the carport. She told herself it might be nothing. He was a deacon after all, and she'd seen him do yard work countless times. But something deep in her gut told her otherwise. That evening, she recounted the entire encounter to her husband, saying how uneasy she'd felt. There was just too much blood, she said, and he was too calm. Her husband advised her not to jump to conclusions, but agreed the situation sounded strange. By morning, Marion decided to take action, discreetly. She called the Hillsborough County Sheriff's Office and asked for someone to check on her property. That call would set in motion the unraveling of one of Florida's most disturbing small-town murder cases of the decade. By the time the Hillsborough County Sheriff's Department received the call from Marion Whitehurst on the evening of May 28, 1996, the rain had started to move in, the kind that came down in sheets and pooled on the back roads of Plant City. For most residents, that kind of storm meant another muggy Florida night. But for deputies responding to Turkey Creek Road, it marked the beginning of one of the most chilling homicide discoveries the quiet community had ever seen. Marion Whitehurst, a respected churchgoer and longtime acquaintance of Samuel Lee Smithers, had made the call after something she couldn't ignore. Earlier that afternoon, she'd visited the property Smithers was renting from her, a 27-acre spread of rural land, thick with oak and pepper trees dotted by shallow ponds. It was the same place where Smithers said he did small landscaping jobs for church members and where occasionally he went to clear his head. But what Marion saw that day didn't sit right. Deputy Mark Douglas was the first to arrive. He knew the area well, long stretches of farmland, rusted mailboxes, and distant neighbors who preferred not to be involved in anyone else's business. He'd read the call log, possible suspicious activity, blood found on property. At first glance, it didn't sound like an emergency. Rural Florida was full of hunters, fishermen, and folks who used their land for just about everything. But the moment his cruiser pulled into the dirt drive, that assumption started to crumble. The rain had softened the ground, turning tire tracks into shallow rivulets. Smithers' white Ford pickup sat idling under the carport just as Marion had described. The lights were on inside the small utility shed, the air heavy with the smell of damp soil and something metallic, faint but distinct. Smithers stepped out before Douglas could even reach the porch. Calm, composed, with that same Sunday smile he wore at church. "Evening, Deputy," he said, wiping his hands on a rag. "Everything okay?" Douglas asked to take a look around. "Sure thing," Smithers replied, gesturing toward the carport. "Marion must have called y'all because of that mess earlier. I told her. I was chopping tree limbs, hit a squirrel or something, made a real bloody scene." The deputy crouched down. The concrete under the carport had recently been washed, but streaks of diluted blood remained visible along the edges, runoff that had mixed with rainwater. Something about the cleanup seemed deliberate, too thorough, too controlled. When Douglas stood, his flashlight caught the faint indentation of drag marks just beyond the carport, grooves pressed into the wet grass, winding away into the darkness. He followed the trail cautiously, boots sinking into the soft earth as the wind carried the smell of rain and pond algae. The drag marks continued for nearly 30 yards, bending slightly before ending near the edge of the largest pond on the property. There, the beam of his flashlight flickered across something pale, breaking the surface. A human arm. Douglas froze. He called for backup immediately, his voice measured but strained. "Possible body in the water. Send additional units and forensics to Turkey Creek Road." Within 30 minutes, the quiet farmland had transformed into a crime scene. Patrol cars lined the dirt road, headlights slicing through mist. Crime scene tape was stretched across the property's entrance, and as detectives arrived, the reality began to set in. They weren't dealing with a missing person or an accident. This was something much darker. When investigators waded in, the body was easy to identify. Christy Cowan, 24, the woman who'd been reported missing weeks earlier. Her remains were partially submerged, tangled in pond reeds. The decomposition and water exposure made it clear she hadn't died recently. But one thing was unmistakable. Her skull showed blunt force trauma, consistent with repeated blows from a heavy object. An axe, perhaps. Detectives noted that Christie's hands were bound with electrical cord and one of her sneakers had come off, found floating a few feet away. Nearby, drag marks on the bank suggested she'd been pulled from the carport to the pond. Not rolled or carried, but dragged by the ankles. Within hours, the Hillsborough County dive team was called in. The divers, equipped with searchlights and sonar, began sweeping the pond's murky bottom just before midnight. The storm had slowed, but the rain hadn't stopped completely, just enough to make visibility almost impossible underwater. At 1:37 a.m., a diver surfaced and shouted to shore, "We've got another one." The second body was found in a separate section of the pond about 50 feet away from the first. She was later identified as Denise Roach, 31, also a missing person last seen in the same East Tampa corridor where Christie had been spotted before her disappearance. Her cause of death mirrored Christie's. Multiple blunt force injuries to the head and neck. The parallels between the two victims were undeniable. Both women had vanished within a 3-week window. Both had ties to Tampa's prostitution and drug scene. Both were last seen entering or speaking with a man driving a white pickup truck. And now, both had been found, buried in water, on the property of the same man. Samuel Lee Smithers, a deacon at East Chelsea Baptist Church, a man whose reputation had been spotless until that night. By dawn on May 29, 1996, the Hillsborough County Sheriff's Office was running on no sleep. The discovery at Turkey Creek Road had shaken even the most seasoned detectives. Two women, Christy Cowan and Denise Roach, had been pulled from the muddy pond on church property, both brutally murdered. Every shred of physical evidence pointed to one man, Samuel Lee Smithers, a deacon, husband, and father who had spent the last decade preaching salvation. Now he was sitting in an interview room. The fluorescent lights flickered softly over his head. Across the table sat Detective Richard Flair and Detective Brian Hunter, veterans of homicide cases, men who had seen every type of killer, except one who wore a cross on his lapel. At 9:12 a.m., the recorder clicked on. "Mr. Smithers," Detective Flair began, voice calm but sharp, "you understand why you're here?" Smithers nodded, hands folded neatly in front of him. "I understand there's been a terrible misunderstanding," he said. His tone was almost pastoral, like a man explaining a sermon. Flair slid a photograph across the table. Christy Cowan, recovered from the pond. "Do you recognize this woman?" Smithers didn't flinch. He looked down, exhaled, and said quietly, "I might have seen her once or twice, around East Tampa maybe." The detectives exchanged a glance. He wasn't denying knowing her, but he wasn't admitting much either. "Mr. Smithers," Hunter said, "we have tire tracks on your property that match your truck. We have drag marks leading to the pond. We have witnesses who saw you with Christy and Denise. You need to help us understand what happened." Smithers' eyes darted to the one-way mirror. "I've done nothing wrong," he said, shaking his head slowly. "Those girls, they were troubled. I tried to help them. I'm a man of faith. I wanted to give them work, clean up, earn a little money, that's all." He was polite, cooperative, but there was a carefulness to every word, a man rehearsing his innocence. For hours, detectives pressed him, about the axe, about the cleaning, about the blood Marion Whitehurst saw. Each time he repeated some version of the same story. "It was an animal. I cut wood. I was just helping." When asked if he'd consent to a polygraph, Smithers didn't hesitate. "I've got nothing to hide," he said. "I'll take it tomorrow." The next morning, May 30th, Smithers returned to the sheriff's office, his wife Gloria by his side. She was quiet, pale, composed but visibly shaken. Detectives led him to the polygraph room while Gloria waited in the hallway. The test began at 10:15 a.m. For nearly 2 hours, the examiner asked a battery of questions about the property, the victims, and his actions that night. Each time, Smithers answered calmly, almost with a pastoral sincerity. When the test concluded, the examiner left to review the results. Smithers sat still, hands clasped, murmuring something under his breath. A prayer, maybe, or just words to keep his nerves from unraveling. At 12:07 p.m., the door opened. Detective Flair stepped in with a folder. "Sam," he said, lowering his voice, "we've gone over the results. The test shows you weren't truthful about what happened to those women." The words hung in the air like static. Smithers blinked once, twice, his composure cracking for the first time. "That can't be right," he said quietly. "I'm telling you, I didn't hurt anybody." Flair leaned in. "The machine doesn't lie, Sam. But you can fix this right now. Tell us what really happened." For a long stretch, Smithers said nothing. Then in a trembling voice he asked, "Can I see my wife?" They brought Gloria into the room. She took a seat beside him, eyes red from crying. The detective stepped out briefly, leaving the couple alone under camera surveillance. "Sam," she whispered, "you need to tell them. You need to be honest." That was the breaking point. The deacon who had spent years preaching redemption now sat with his head in his hands, shaking. When the detectives returned, he lifted his eyes and said quietly, "I'll tell you what happened. But it wasn't supposed to be like this." Smithers began his statement just after 1 p.m. He said he'd met Christy Cowan near East Hillsborough Avenue earlier that month. She'd been upset, talking about money and her addiction, saying she needed a place to clean up and think. Smithers claimed he offered her work-clearing brush at the Turkey Creek property. According to him, when they got there, things took a turn. He said Christy became agitated when he couldn't pay her the full amount he'd promised. She began shouting, accusing him of lying, of trying to take advantage of her. He claimed she lunged at him with a small garden tool, and in panic, he swung the axe. "She fell," he said softly. "It was fast. I didn't mean to kill her." He paused, wiping his face. "I didn't know what to do. I dragged her to the pond. I thought, if nobody found her, maybe it would all go away." Detective Hunter leaned forward. "And Denise? What about her?" Smithers hesitated. "That one was different," he muttered. "She came by later, a week or so. I tried to give her work too, but she found the bloodstains near the shed. She started screaming, said she was going to the police. I couldn't let that happen." He admitted striking her as well, again with the axe. He described wrapping both bodies, dragging them to separate parts of the pond, and cleaning the area afterward. "I didn't want to hurt them," he said, almost pleading. "They were lost. I was trying to help them." It was a confession, though not a consistent one. The details shifted, the timeline blurred, some parts contradicted evidence, but it was enough. After 5 hours of questioning, detectives turned off the recorder. The statement was transcribed and signed. The deacon had confessed to murder. Following the confession, investigators executed a second full search warrant on both Smithers' Turkey Creek property and his residence in Plant City. This time, they weren't looking for clues. They were collecting proof. Crime scene technicians returned to the ponds with metal detectors and forensic dredging equipment. The rain had subsided, but the ground was still slick and heavy with mud. They recovered the axe, still resting in the shed where Smithers had cleaned it, along with a pair of work boots caked in mud. The sole tread on those boots matched the shoe prints found near the pond's edge. Inside Smithers' home, forensic teams located blood-stained clothing wrapped inside a trash bag beneath a crawl space. Testing confirmed the blood matched Christy Cowan. Further analysis revealed semen traces consistent with Smithers' DNA and partial profiles that could not exclude Denise Roach. Combined with the drag marks, the witness sightings, and his own confession, the physical evidence painted an airtight case. Even the axe handle told its story. Microscopic blood fibers, fingerprints beneath the lacquer, and a single hair strand linked to one of the victims. It was all there. But as detectives dug deeper, Smithers' narrative started to unravel. For one, no defensive wounds were found on either woman that matched his version of being attacked. The blows were deliberate, consistent, and inflicted from behind, not during a struggle. Moreover, the idea that Denise simply showed up later made little sense. Witnesses had placed him near East Tampa multiple times in both victims' final days, suggesting premeditation, not coincidence. When confronted with these discrepancies, Smithers shifted again. "I don't remember everything clearly," he told detectives on May 31st during a follow-up interview. "It was all a blur. I just remember the noise, the panic. I was afraid of what people would think. I thought I'd lose my church, my family. I didn't know what else to do." To investigators, that wasn't confusion. It was calculation. Detective Flair later described the moment Smithers confessed as eerily calm. He didn't shout, didn't cry uncontrollably. His tone, Flair said, was more like a man admitting a sin during prayer than someone confessing to 2 brutal murders. At one point, Smithers reportedly bowed his head and whispered, "Lord, forgive me, I failed them." When the detectives asked if he had prayed for the victims afterward, Smithers nodded. "Yes," he said softly. "I prayed the Lord would take them to peace." That statement chilled the room. It was the kind of quiet justification that detectives had seen in killers who believed their actions could somehow be cleansed through faith. Meanwhile, in a separate room, Smithers' wife sat in disbelief. Gloria had spent nearly 2 decades beside him, the same man who volunteered at church picnics and led youth prayer groups. When detectives informed her that her husband had confessed, she broke down. "No," she said, shaking her head. "He helps people, he brings food to them, he wouldn't hurt anyone." But then they showed her the photographs, the property, the drag marks, the pond. Her voice fell to a whisper. "He used to say he needed time alone, that the church work was stressful." She covered her face. "Oh, Sam." By the end of that week, Smithers was formally charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder. The local media exploded with headlines that sounded impossible. "Deacon arrested in double murder. Bodies found on church land." Neighbors described him as gentle, a man of God, someone who mowed lawns for widows. But investigators saw something else, a man living a double life, one that thrived in control and secrecy. A man who used his status as a shield while preying on the vulnerable. As word spread, parishioners from East Chelsea Baptist Church gathered in stunned silence. Some prayed for his soul, others refused to believe it at all. But the evidence, both forensic and physical, told the truth. The interrogation, while procedural, exposed something larger, a disturbing intersection between faith, guilt, and violence. Smithers wasn't a criminal mastermind. He was an everyman with a mask, the kind that made him invisible. His confession gave detectives closure but left the community fractured. How could someone who led prayers for the broken be the very hand that broke them? That contradiction became the core of the case, and later the trial's emotional fulcrum. Smithers' calm demeanor, his shaky confession, and his claim that the murders were accidents collided with the brutal evidence recovered from the property. Blood, rope, axe. 2 women silenced and buried in water, all under the watch of a man who preached forgiveness. When the interrogation finally ended, Smithers sat quietly as deputies led him from the room. The walk down the hallway was long, lined with officers who avoided eye contact. Some had been to his church. Some had shaken his hand at community events. Now, they were cuffing him for murder. Outside, reporters were already gathered, cameras flashing as he was placed in the back of a patrol car. Rain began to fall again, steady and cold, washing over the asphalt like it had on the night the bodies were found. Through the tinted glass, Smithers stared straight ahead. No tears, no visible remorse, only silence. Inside the interrogation room, the tape recorder still sat on the table, its red light blinking steadily, the last witness to the fall of a man who once preached salvation. From the moment the trial began, the prosecution had an apparent advantage. Smithers had confessed. In 1996, detectives recorded his admission, calm, clear, and detailed, about killing both women and disposing of their bodies in the ponds on his property. His words had been played in pretrial hearings, transcribed, analyzed, and verified. But on the first day of testimony, Smithers' defense team shocked the courtroom by announcing that the confession was a lie. His attorney, Rick Tarana, a skilled and aggressive public defender, told the jury that his client had been emotionally broken and psychologically pressured during interrogation. He painted Smithers not as a murderer, but as a frightened, manipulated man, a husband and father who confessed to crimes he didn't commit because he feared for his family's safety. When Smithers took the stand, his voice was soft, his posture stoic. "I didn't kill those women," he told the jury. "I said what they wanted me to say because I was scared. They told me I could lose my wife, my son. They told me it'd be better if I just admitted it." The jury watched him closely. He was articulate, measured, even tearful at times, a stark contrast to the violent image prosecutors had painted. But his recantation raised more questions than it answered. Why, jurors wondered, had a man supposedly coerced into confessing also led police directly to evidence on his own property? Why had he described the sequence of events in such vivid, specific detail? Information only the killer could have known. The prosecution reminded them of that detail immediately. Assistant State Attorney Jack Espinosa Jr. stood and told the court, "Ladies and gentlemen, this is not a man who stumbled into a false confession. This is a man who knew where to find bodies." With the confession now under attack, Smithers' defense shifted to an even more dramatic narrative. The new centerpiece of his story was a man who, according to Smithers, had orchestrated everything, a faceless, nameless figure he referred to only as Mr. X. It was a last-ditch effort, and it captivated the courtroom. Smithers claimed that Mr. X, an acquaintance from his church and someone with a history of trouble, had come to him in May 1996 seeking help with yard work at the Fish Hatchery Road property. When Smithers arrived, he said, things took a dark turn. In his testimony, Smithers described the first encounter. He and Christy were arguing by the carport. She was screaming about money. Before I knew it, he hit her. I tried to stop him. He pulled a gun. He told me I was going to help him clean it up or my family would pay for it. Smithers claimed that 2 days later, Mr. X returned with another woman, Denise Roach, and repeated the same horrifying pattern. This time, Smithers said he was forced at gunpoint to help dispose of both women in the ponds, terrified and helpless to intervene. To explain the cleaned carport, the drag marks, and the blood, Smithers said, "I did what I had to do to stay alive." The courtroom fell silent as he spoke. It was a dramatic story, one with enough cinematic flair to make jurors lean forward. But the more investigators dissected it, the less sense it made. Who was Mr. X? What was his real name? Where was he now? When pressed for details, Smithers' answers were vague. He was a friend from church, he said. He knew people who could hurt my family. Detectives had spent years combing through every name Smithers mentioned. Friends, co-workers, fellow churchgoers. No one fit the description. No one had a record of visiting the Fish Hatchery Road property, and no one had been seen near the scene of the murders in late May 1996. The prosecution called it a ghost story for guilty men. To counter Smithers' new version, prosecutors meticulously reassembled the physical evidence, piece by piece, to show that only one person could have committed the crimes. Forensic specialists from the Florida Department of Law Enforcement, FDLE, testified that blood found inside the carport matched both victims. The blood pattern suggested a violent struggle, not a quick or accidental death. Crime scene technicians also presented photographs of the drag marks that stretched from the carport to the edge of the pond, consistent with someone pulling a body. Smithers' shoe prints matched those impressions almost exactly, including unique wear marks on the sole of his boots. When officers searched his home, they found a pair of muddy jeans, a blood-stained towel, and a recently cleaned axe, all with traces of human blood. DNA analysis couldn't exclude Smithers or Roach as contributors to those stains. Prosecutor Espinosa reminded the jury that Smithers himself had led detectives to the area where both bodies were found. "Mr. Smithers," he told the court, "I didn't just know what happened. He knew where to find it." Witnesses from his church also took the stand, reluctantly acknowledging a different side of the man they once trusted. A church secretary described him as distant, stressed, and irritable in the weeks leading up to the murders. Another member recalled seeing him with Christy Cowan multiple times, despite his claims that he barely knew her. The portrait emerging was one of hidden tension, a man leading a double life. By the time closing arguments began, the Mr. X story had all but unraveled. Espinosa's voice echoed through the courtroom as he summarized the evidence. He cleaned the carport. He washed the axe. He dragged 2 women to the water and dumped them. Then he went home and told his wife he'd been cutting tree limbs. Ladies and gentlemen, that is not fear. That is guilt. The defense tried to reignite sympathy, telling the jury that Smithers was a family man, a man of faith, and that even the most devout could be pushed into false confession under enough pressure. But the jurors weren't convinced. After deliberating for less than 4 hours, the 12 men and women returned to the courtroom. The foreman stood and delivered the verdict, guilty of first-degree murder for both Christy Cowan and Denise Roach. Smithers sat motionless, eyes fixed on the table before him. His wife, seated behind him, began to cry silently. The victims' families clasped hands, some whispering prayers of relief. Following the guilty verdict, the court moved to the penalty phase. Florida law required the same jury to recommend either life imprisonment or death. The prosecution emphasized the cruelty of the crimes: 2 separate killings, deliberate concealment, and attempts to mislead investigators. They argued that Smithers' position as a church deacon made the murders even more egregious, calling it a betrayal of trust and faith. Family members of both victims delivered impact statements that drew tears across the courtroom. Christy's sister told the court, "He didn't just take her life, he took away every bit of peace our family had left." Denise's mother followed, her voice breaking. "She wasn't perfect, but she was my daughter, and he dumped her like trash." The defense asked for mercy, pleading that Smithers had no prior criminal record, no history of violence, and that a death sentence would only create another victim. When the jury returned, the recommendation was clear: death, by a vote of 11-1. Judge Daniel Perry affirmed the sentence, stating that the killings were heinous, atrocious, and cruel. After the verdict, reporters crowded the courthouse steps. Local television crews from Tampa and Orlando called it the Deacon Murders Trial. It became a cautionary tale, a story about deception, religion, and hidden darkness. Even after sentencing, Smithers refused to admit guilt. He told a reporter during a post-trial interview, "I didn't do it. One day the truth will come out." For more than 2 decades, Samuel Lee Smithers languished on Florida's death row, his fate tied up in a labyrinth of appeals, stays, resentencing requests, and legal motions. From 1999 onward, every possible procedural avenue was explored, from direct appeals to the Florida Supreme Court, to federal habeas corpus petitions and state post-conviction motions. But time and again, his conviction and sentence were upheld. The courts consistently found no reversible error. The confession, forensic evidence, and pattern of behavior remained intact. As the years passed, Smithers aged behind bars. His health deteriorated, his prospects dimmed, but his attorneys never ceased fighting. Their appeals argued issues ranging from alleged ineffective counsel to new forensic technologies and evolving standards of decency. But none succeeded. Then came September 12, 2025. That was the date Governor Ron DeSantis signed Smithers' death warrant, officially scheduling the execution for October 14, 2025. The signing stirred renewed attention. Media outlets pointed out that Florida was on pace to break records for executions in a single year. Smithers, now 72, was set to become one of the oldest people scheduled for execution in state history. His case, once dormant in legal files and appellate dockets, suddenly lit up again. Supporters of the victims' families celebrated the warrant as a step toward closure. But for Smithers' legal team, it was just the prelude to a final, urgent push, a last-minute bid to stay what would be the end. In late September 2025, just weeks before the scheduled execution, Smithers' attorneys filed one more motion. A constitutional appeal based not on new forensic evidence, but on Smithers' advancing age and the evolving legal argument that executing the elderly may constitute a violation of the Eighth Amendment's ban on cruel and unusual punishment. At 72 years old, Smithers' defense contended excising the human context from a death sentence meant little. They argued that he no longer posed the youthful threat or deterrence that death sentences are often justified by, and that executing someone weakened by decades in prison served none of the traditional penological goals: retribution, deterrence, or incapacitation. In their filing, defense counsel asserted retribution lessens over time. The emotional intensity fueling a demand for death after a murder fades over decades. The public's moral outrage has cooled and the emotional stake is distant. Diminished deterrence. A man long confined cannot deter new crime from beyond bars. His death offers no new public protection. Proportionality and evolving standards. In modern jurisprudence, courts increasingly recognize that extreme punishment on infirm, aged inmates may violate evolving standards of decency. Physical frailty and suffering. They argued that aging bodies react differently to lethal injection, that comorbidities increase the risk of pain or complications, making execution for an aged inmate a crueler prospect than for a younger one. Their plea is that executing an elderly person in this condition would not just punish the crime, it would punish time itself. In early October 2025, a circuit court handed down a denial of the motion. The judge ruled that Florida law and precedent did not recognize advanced age by itself as a bar to execution. The court found no established constitutional principle compelling relief. Unwilling to accept that outcome, Smithers' defense immediately appealed to the Florida Supreme Court asking for an expedited hearing. The appeal presented a high-stakes constitutional question: whether executing a 72-year-old man so many years after conviction, when much of the penal rationale has faded, violates state or federal law. In denying the age-based argument, the state courts acknowledged that Smithers' case was unusual. Few capital inmates survived decades on death row, but said that precedent and doctrine did not support creating a new constitutional rule. The filing stressed that Smithers' own appeal strategy had extended the timeline, and that finality in capital cases is also a constitutional value. Behind the scenes, in briefings and internal memoranda, defense attorneys warned that if the courts declined the appeal, the execution would proceed, and Smithers might have exhausted his final legal lifeline. As October's days trickled closer, two parallel dramas played out. On the legal front, Smithers' attorneys scrambled to file emergency briefs, invoke constitutional principles, and request stay orders. They petitioned the Florida Supreme Court to hear the case quickly, arguing that error or denial would irreversibly cross the line from life to death. On the human front, media attention focused on Smithers' age and health. News outlets ran stories referencing his 72 years frail condition, and the larger question: can and should a state execute someone so old? The Death Penalty Information Center flagged his case as a rare example where lifespan and time behind bars become part of the argument. Critics of capital punishment echoed parts of the defense argument. Some legal scholars cited the concept of the lackey claim, named after a former death row inmate who argued that prolonged confinement plus execution amounts to cruel and unusual punishment, though courts have generally rejected it. Still, in Florida, courts have shown reluctance to expand constitutional protections retroactively. When Smithers' defense tried to invoke the principle of evolving standards of decency, the courts pointed to prior precedent that prohibits creating new rules unless dictated by constitutional mandate. As mid-October approached, everyone knew one thing: unless something dramatic happened, a stay, a reprieve from the governor, a court reversal, Smithers would face lethal injection on the appointed date. True crime is not just about the horror of what happened, but the lessons we take away. If you believe victims' names should never be forgotten, hit the like button and share this video so more people hear her story.